Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with the summary of our first 4 videos on how to listen to great music. And this summary consists of a story. It's the story of how I first heard Grieg's Peer Gynt Suite, which is the piece we talked about over the course of our 4 videos, one for each of its 4 movements. This is kind of like, if I said some of this before, pieces may have showed up in other videos, but here's the whole enchilada. When I was in 4th grade, I had a completely psychotic teacher. She was an ex-nun who left the Catholic Church because she thought that the Second Vatican Council had been far too liberalizing, and she was upset by what she perceived as a lack of discipline in the church. Mind you, I was in public school, and she was crazy. She had ideas of discipline which she thought were best inflicted on school children. And part of those was that we were assigned numbers. We did not have names. We were all known by our number. I was number 10. I spent my entire 4th grade year as number 10. And the reason we had numbers was because she believed that we were going to be attacked at any moment by the Soviet Union, which may still happen. Who knows? But she felt that when the nuclear bombs were dropping, it would be far too noisy for her to call out our names during the fire drill or whatever it was when we were supposed to be running around in a panic outside in the schoolyard. Now, needless to say, the reason she needed to call out our names during the nuclear attack was because we always had to line up alphabetically. That's why I was number 10, because H was number 10. Margaret Angelo was number 1. We were all very jealous. Of course, she probably didn't feel so lucky to be the first person in every line. So we had to line up our desks alphabetically. We had to walk down the hallway in schools alphabetically, segregated male and female, a certain number of linoleum blocks from the wall, a certain number of linoleum blocks in between each of us, or else the penalty would not be worth considering. We had to line up our desks on the linoleum cracks in the floor. She was a loon, like I said, a complete and utter loon. Anyway, so what does this have to do with the Peer Gynt Suite? Well, we had, of course, in 4th grade to study geography. Now, geography when you're only in 4th grade is usually a fairly simple thing. You know, you have a textbook, geography textbook. It's like Our World, isn't it wonderful? And it has a chapter on different places, and you read them, and you have a quiz, and that's geography. No, that was not her view of geography. She felt that that was far too superficial, and that what we needed to do was to study each region or country in depth. And because this was a big textbook and it was terribly superficial, we only had time to do 3 countries in the entire year. The first was India. The last wasn't a separate country, it was Hawaii, but she sort of felt it was a separate country. That was her thing, where we had to build an entire Hawaiian village, which I was allergic to, so I got to sit out most of that particular 3-month period. But in the middle, between India and between Hawaii, we did Norway. Yes, are we starting to get to the Peer Gynt Suite? I think we are. And for Norway, we had to look at, we were delving into fjords, and she had some Norwegian person come in and talk about Norway, and it just was endless. And we had, Vikings running around and all of that stuff. But one day, we come into class, and she was showing like some documentary on Norway, and she put on a recording of Peer Gynt. And here we are at Peer Gynt. Only Morning Mood, the first number, which was our 3rd talk, I believe, in this series. And I thought it was just beautiful, especially because she had to shut up while we listened to it. It was just beautiful. We all asked for her to play it again so she would leave us alone. 4th grade was really a nightmare. It really, really was. I have more stories about 4th grade, but that's the basic one. So she put on Morning from Peer Gynt. She didn't play the rest of it. She didn't. I'm sure that Ozzy's death would have been completely unacceptable because Ozzy was Protestant, was going straight to hell as far as she was concerned. And of course, Anitra's dance, well, that was total debauchery. I mean, that was far too sexy, and she wasn't going to play that. And in the Hall of the Mountain King, the Hall of the Mountain King, well, I mean, that was trolls. I mean, that was the spawn of Satan. She wasn't going to expose us to that. So all we heard was mourning from the Peer Gynt Suite. But that was enough to get me hooked on the Peer Gynt Suite. Subsequent to that, after that, I actually heard in the Hall of the Mountain King in a different music class when I finally got to 7th grade. By then I was in private school. And we just heard it as part of our music course. You know, there was that little textbook, maybe some of you saw it, it was called Making Music Your Own. And it had all kinds of strange things in it. And one of them was in the Hall of the Mountain King. So we heard that. And I thought to myself, I had remembered mourning from 4th grade. And I thought, gee, this is really, really beautiful. And then came the clincher. And this I'll never forget. When I was bar mitzvahed, I was still 12 when I was bar mitzvahed. And that was in 1973, I think, or somewhere around there. I got as a gift an 8-track player. And I'm sure my parents regret having purchased that 8-track player because they knew not what they did. It opened up a whole Pandora's box of collecting and whatnot. Now, do you remember 8-track players? They had these thick, bulky cartridges, and you shoved it in the machine. And it was 8 tracks because it was 4 stereo tracks. And this had this tape that it turned onto 4 different sides. And the problem with 8-track players was that they could only play everything. Every side had to be the same length. You had to play the whole length of the tape before it could ka-chung over. And that length was some very strange, arbitrary time limit. Maybe it was like 10 minutes or something. And so for classical pieces, you can only imagine it was just horrible because whenever the tape ended, they had to break up the piece. If it was a long piece, then, like the first movement of Brahms' First Symphony, I remember, was on 2 sides in the middle of half a bar of something. It was awful what happened. But I got in the Hall of the Mountain King, I got the whole Peer Gynt Suite. And the Peer Gynt Suite that I got was Eugene Ormandy, the Philadelphia Orchestra, because we American families in the 1970s and the early 70s got Columbia and RCA records. Those were our major domestic labels. And they made 8-track tapes. So I had Eugene Ormandy's Peer Gynt Suite, and this is what made me crazy. My favorite part of the Peer Gynt Suite was in the Hall of the Mountain King. Naturally, mourning was very beautiful, but it had those unhappy associations with 4th grade. So, and all I could think of was number 10, whenever I heard it. I've since, gotten over it after years of therapy. But the In the Hall of the Mountain King occurred at the end of one of the tape sides. And so they had to break it in half. Now, in the Hall of the Mountain King is only like 3 minutes long, 2.5 minutes maximally. But they stopped it where they had to stop it, and you had to wait. You had to wait and wait and wait for this tape to chick over because it had to use up all the rest of the tape that had to be the length of whatever the longest part was. And so I'm waiting and waiting and waiting. It took like 8 minutes. I don't know. It made me nuts because it was da 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 da. And then you wait, and you sat, and you waited. And 5 minutes later, it would finally go ka-ching to, track number 3 or whatever it was, or side 3. And then it was do 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 do. Oh gosh, it was annoying. I couldn't wait till I had LPs and cassettes. I mean, anything that would let me hear the entire In the Hall of the Mountain King. Maybe that's why I started these talks within the Hall of the Mountain King, because I subconsciously just wanted to hear the whole thing all the way through several times and play it for other people the way it's supposed to sound. So that's how we started. But let's just recapitulate briefly how much we've learned from just listening to the Peer Gynt Suite. Now, in the Hall of the Mountain King, we talked about how music can express even more intensely the feelings and expressions that music with words can, because In the Hall of the Mountain King originally had words. But the piece without the words is mood and atmosphere and emotional intensity, and it's more generalized. It's more universalized, if you want to call it that. It's gone from the specifics of having words and having words in Norwegian, never mind words. It's a very simple and basic principle, but it's worth remembering and keeping in mind, especially if you're just getting started listening to classical music or music without words or instrumentals, that the music is expressing something, even if you don't know what it is. It's up to you as the listener to be engaged with the music and to come up with your own scenario, whatever works for you, if you believe the music is trying to speak to you and you feel it. If you feel it, you must feel something. And what you feel is what you're feeling, right? I mean, that's how it works. So then we went on to the second movement, the Hall of the Mountain King being the fourth movement, Ozzy's Death. And there we learned the marvels of harmony, how the simplest tune in the world, which is what that is, repeated any number of times, can have completely different characteristics depending on how the composer harmonizes it. And we also learned that the harmony can make the music want to move on, or it can stop it or find a way to conclude it in a satisfying way. All of that just from playing this simple little tune scored just for muted strings. Very, very beautiful within the context of that one single scene, that one brief movement. Then, of course, we did Morning. And Morning was really fun because Morning introduced us to two different topics. The first was topics, that is, it introduced us to the topic of topics. That is, that there's a long history of music in the Western tradition treating certain subjects over and over again and treating them in a fairly standard way. In this case, the topic that we were looking at was pastoral music. And I noticed in the comments, several of you mentioned other examples of pastoral music that I didn't bring up because we played certain other cases, other instances, from Handel to Haydn to Beethoven to Dvorak. You mentioned the third section of Rossini's The William Tell Overture, which is unquestionably a pastoral. But so is the second section, which is a storm. It's a thunderstorm. I know we don't think of thunderstorms as relaxing pastoral music, but they're definitely pastoral because they're outdoors and they happen in the countryside. There's one of them in Beethoven's Pastoral Symphony. So scenes of nature in the general sense, which is what pastoral really encompasses, the idea of the pastoral, are all part of our Western musical tradition. And if you understand what the modality of expression is in pastoral music, then you will absolutely have an opportunity to get to know lots and lots and lots of music without having to work too hard. It's telling you what it is, straight up, just by listening, without needing words or anything else. And finally, we did Anitra's dance. And with Anitra's dance, we looked at melodic shapes, certain formal concepts that recur very, very frequently in crafting the tunes that are part of our Western tradition and that we love so well. And again, if you can hear the shape, if you can hear the form of the tune, you can relate that form to other examples, which may be fast or slow or loud or soft or modern and gnarly sounding or Baroque or hundreds of years old. It's all the same form. And listening to form is something that is a marvelous way to get a handle on what's happening in classical music. So all of that has been encompassed by these first four talks on how to listen to great music. And I do this little summary just as a way of letting you know, kind of like what Debussy did in his preludes. Do you know what those are? They're piano pieces where he wrote the piece and then at the end, he gave you the title. So you have to hear the music first before you learned what the title of it was and what it might have represented. And that's how I feel this talk is. Listen to those talks, and then here it is, the summary of what we were doing all the while. But if you haven't heard those first four talks, please take the time to go through them at your leisure. Give them a chance And then we're going to move on to other things, other topics, other works that we'll go through systematically, just as we did the marvelous four movements of the Peer Gynt Suite. I only want to close with this particular thought about the Peer Gynt Suite. We need to consider not just each movement individually, but also how all four of them are grouped together. It's actually a very, very interesting and sophisticated thing that Grieg has done, because he's taken the four sections, and some of you may already know that a lot of large works like sonatas and symphonies also come in four sections, and he has created, in effect, a mini symphony based on the topic of Peer Gynt, on the subjects of Henrik Ibsen's play. And these pieces are marvelously well contrasted to make a satisfying whole. You have a opening morning, which is an introduction if ever there was one, right? It's like sunrise and waking up and dawn. And then you have a slow section, an intense section of emotional depth. Then you have a light little dance, which would correspond to the third movement of a symphony, which is often a scherzo or a minuet. And then an exciting slam-bang finale, a dazzling finale with the largest orchestra used in the entire suite, and the quickest tempo, and the most noise, and the most satisfying conclusion possible. And so the entire piece is not four individual things. I mean, we've listened to them separately, and you can talk about them separately, especially if you're in fourth grade being taught by a psycho ex-nun, pardon me, who would morally object to everything else in the suite. But no, they belong together, and they're organized in the way that makes for the most satisfying listening entirely. And so one of the things we're going to be talking about as we move on in this series is what creates unity out of the diverse sections that make up large classical forms. Because the difference between classical or instrumental music and what we normally hear every day in pop music, songs, things like that, is simply a question of form. It's about how big it is and how it's assembled, and the different ways of writing big music assembled differently are the things that give us all the instrumental forms that we're going to be discussing. A song is a song, a symphony is a symphony. They're different versions of musical form. And that's something that we will be talking a lot about, actually. But I will be giving you the tools to hear those things without any kind of intimidation or worry about what you're actually listening to. That's the goal. You can just plonk it on, and even if you hate it, it's not about whether you like it or hate it. It's about understanding what it is. And that I can tell you. I can't promise you're going to like everything, but I can promise that you will know what it is. And that is at least half the battle. After that, you go and find all the things that you like. So keep on listening, folks. Thank you so much for joining me for these talks. Take care.